On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. Within hours, the world turned upside down for Japanese Americans. The next day, the hunt for internal enemies began. The FBI arrested over 1,000 leaders of the Japanese American community. They seized Japanese language teachers, Buddhist priests, heads of community organizations, and successful businessmen. They were accused of potential disloyalty without any evidence. Approximately 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry lived on the west coast of the United States. 2/3 of them were American citizens, born on U.S. soil. They had never been to Japan. They spoke English, attended American schools, and considered themselves Americans. But their appearance made them suspect in the eyes of a frightened society. The press fueled hysteria. Newspapers ran headlines about Japanese spies and saboteurs. They printed fabricated stories about signals to enemy submarines. They created the image of a fifth column ready to strike from within. Politicians demanded decisive action. Military officials insisted on evacuation. Public opinion demanded action. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, a dry, bureaucratic document that upended the lives of tens of thousands of people. The order allowed military authorities to declare any areas as military zones and remove any persons from them. Technically, the order didn't mention Japanese people, but everyone understood who it targeted. In the spring of 1942, forced evacuation began. Notices appeared on poles and walls. Families were given a week to pack. They could only take what fit in suitcases and what they could carry. Everything else had to be left behind or sold for next to nothing. Scavengers profited from others' misfortune. They offered $100 for a piano, $50 for a car, laughable sums for entire farms. People agreed, because the alternative was to simply abandon everything. Some entrusted their property to white neighbors hoping to return. Many of these neighbors appropriated the property for themselves or sold it. Assembly points were set up at racetracks and fairgrounds. Families stood in lines with tags on their clothing, like goods in a warehouse. They were photographed, registered, their luggage inspected. Children cried. The elderly remained silent, not understanding what was happening. Young people tried to maintain dignity in the face of humiliation. From assembly points, people were transported to camps. 10 relocation centers were built in the most inhospitable places in the country: the deserts of California, Arizona, and Utah, the swamps of Arkansas, remote areas of Wyoming and Idaho. Places where white Americans didn't want to live were deemed good enough for citizens with the wrong skin color. Manzanar was located at the foot of the Sierra Nevada mountains in California. 10,000 people lived in barracks on a wind-swept plain. In summer, temperatures rose above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. In winter, they dropped below freezing. Dust storms covered the camp, sand penetrating everywhere. Topaz in Utah was called the Jewel of the Desert. The cruel irony of the name wasn't lost on its inhabitants. 8,000 people in barracks in the middle of a salt desert. Spring mud turned roads into swamps. Summer heat dried the earth to concrete hardness. Winter blizzards buried the flimsy structures in snow. Minidoka in Idaho, Hart Mountain in Wyoming, Tule Lake in California, Gila River and Poston in Arizona, Granada in Colorado, Rower and Jerome in Arkansas. 10 camps, tens of thousands of prisoners, American citizens whose crime was their ancestry. The barracks were built quickly and cheaply. Wooden frames covered with boards with gaps between them, tar paper roofs, no insulation. Inside, they were divided into sections measuring 20 by 25 feet. Each section housed a family, sometimes two, army cots, an iron stove, a bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling. This was home for an indefinite period. Communal latrines, without partitions between toilets. Communal showers without curtains. For people raised with traditional Japanese notions of modesty and privacy, this was particularly humiliating. Women tried to fashion curtains from scraps of cloth. They went to the toilet in groups to shield each other. Mess halls operated on schedule. Long lines, 3 times a day. The food was cheap and monotonous. Canned goods, powdered milk, whatever could be bought in bulk at low prices. For people accustomed to home-cooked Japanese cuisine, this was torture. Families stopped eating together. Children ate with friends, parents separately. Traditional family structure was breaking down. Barbed wire surrounded the camps, guard towers every few hundred yards. Searchlights illuminated the grounds at night. Guards with rifles patrolled the perimeter. Officially, this was for protecting the inmates from hostile locals. But the rifle barrels pointed inward, not outward. People tried to create some semblance of normal life. They organized schools for children, published newspapers in English and Japanese, formed sports leagues. Teams played baseball on dusty fields, created churches and temples, grew gardens on desert land. This was resistance through preserving humanity, but the psychological cost was enormous. Fathers lost their role as family providers. Their earnings in camp ranged from $12 to $19 per month, less than what Army soldiers received. Traditional family hierarchy was crumbling. Children adapted faster, spoke better English, became the link between families and administration. The older generation, the Issei, born in Japan, suffered most of all. They had built their lives in America over decades, worked from dawn to dusk on farms and in shops, believed in the American dream. Now their dream had turned into a nightmare behind barbed wire. Many withdrew into themselves, lost the will to live. The younger generation, the Nisei, born in America, experienced an identity crisis. They grew up as Americans, taught to love America and its values. In schools, they studied the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Now, it turned out that these rights and freedoms didn't extend to people with their appearance. Some became bitter. Others decided to prove their American loyalty. In this atmosphere of pain and humiliation, the government decided to draft Japanese Americans into the Army. In January 1943, Secretary of War Henry Stimson announced the formation of a combat unit from volunteers of Japanese ancestry. The cynicism of the situation was obvious. The country that had taken away their freedom was now asking them to risk their lives. In February, all adult inmates were asked to fill out a loyalty questionnaire. 30 questions were supposed to determine who was trustworthy, but 2 questions became a stumbling block. Question 27 asked if they were willing to serve in the U.S. Armed Forces in combat. Question 28 required them to swear unqualified allegiance to the U.S. and forswear allegiance to the Japanese emperor. These questions tore families apart. At dinner tables in stuffy barracks, heated debates unfolded. Young people wanted to prove their loyalty. Parents feared losing their sons. Some saw service as a way to escape the camp. Others considered it a betrayal of those remaining behind barbed wire. Question 28 was particularly insidious for immigrant parents. American laws prohibited them from becoming U.S. citizens. If they renounced Japanese citizenship, they would become people without a country. The government was essentially demanding they make themselves stateless. Those who answered no, no, to both questions became outcasts. They were called traitors and cowards. Families split. Friends became enemies. The no, no respondents were sent to a separate camp at Tule Lake, which became a high-security prison. It held the dangerous and disloyal. Conditions became even harsher. Surveillance intensified. But thousands answered yes. Yes, about 10,000 volunteers from the mainland U.S. and 23,000 from Hawaii enlisted in the Army. For many, this was an act of faith, faith that America could be better, that their sacrifice would change attitudes toward Japanese Americans, that their children would live in a different country. Saying goodbye to families was agonizing. Sons left camps, leaving parents behind barbed wire. Mothers wept, sending children off to war, not knowing if they would see them again. Fathers tried to maintain composure, hiding tears behind traditional restraint. Younger siblings watched those departing with admiration and fear. The volunteers were sent to Camp Shelby in Mississippi for training. There, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team was being formed. They were joined by the 100th Infantry Battalion, which had already seen combat and suffered heavy losses. Hawaiian and mainland Japanese Americans initially viewed each other with suspicion. Hawaiians considered mainlanders too submissive. Mainlanders didn't understand Hawaiian slang and mannerisms. Conflicts erupted frequently. Fights between groups were common. But gradually, they learned to understand each other. Mainlanders told stories about life in camps, and Hawaiians began to grasp the scale of injustice. What united them was a shared desire to prove that Japanese Americans deserved respect. Training was rigorous. Instructor officers treated them with distrust. Some were openly hostile. Soldiers had to work twice as hard to prove their worth. They accepted the challenge. They shot better, marched more precisely, executed orders faster than other units. The local Mississippi population met them with hostility. In the town near the base, Japanese Americans were refused service. There were incidents of verbal abuse and even attacks. But something happened that changed attitudes. Several soldiers saw a white girl drowning in a river. They rushed to save her, risking their lives. The girl was saved. The town began to look at them differently. The regiment's motto became, "Go for broke." In Hawaiian slang, this was a call to overcome obstacles at any cost. The emblem featured the Statue of Liberty's torch and a hand with fingers crossed, a symbol that soldiers had each other's backs. In the spring of 1944, the regiment boarded ships. The transatlantic crossing took weeks. In cramped holds, soldiers played cards, wrote letters home, thought about upcoming battles. Many had never left the state where they were born. Now they were crossing an ocean to fight on another continent. They landed in Naples in May 1944. Italy was torn by war. Destroyed cities, starving population, roads clogged with refugees. They were immediately thrown into combat. German troops occupied fortified positions in the hills north of Rome. The task was simple: break through the defense and open the path to the capital. The first baptism by fire was brutal. German machine guns mowed down ranks. Mortars exploded among advancing troops. Soldiers saw comrades they had trained with for months die. One moment, a person was running alongside. The next moment, he was gone. Medics worked non-stop, but there were too many wounded. But they kept advancing. Go for broke meant not stopping, even when it seemed impossible. They scrambled up slopes under fire, stormed fortified positions, fought Germans hand-to-hand when ammunition ran out. Their fury and determination frightened the enemy. German soldiers didn't expect such tenacity. In a few weeks of fighting, the 442nd Regiment captured several key heights. On June 4, 1944, American forces entered Rome. The 442nd Regiment marched in the vanguard. Romans greeted the liberators with flowers and embraces. For the soldiers, this was a moment of triumph. But it was tinged with the bitterness of losses. Hundreds of their comrades lay in the Italian hills. After a brief rest, they were sent to France. In August, They participated in the landing in southern France. The operation was successful. German resistance was quickly broken. The regiment moved north, liberating one town after another. The French greeted them with jubilation. They didn't know about the camps in America. They saw only American liberator soldiers. In one small town, an elderly French woman hugged a Japanese-American soldier with tears in her eyes. She repeated, "Merci, merci, mes liberateurs." The soldier stood motionless, feeling a lump in his throat. In America, his family was behind barbed wire. In France, he was called a liberator. The absurdity of the situation was too obvious. September brought fighting in the Vosges Mountains. Dense forests, steep slopes, cold rains. The Germans had turned the mountains into a fortress. Every tree could hide a sniper. Every path was mined. Visibility was nearly zero. Combat occurred at close range, often without seeing the enemy. On October 24th, the lost battalion from Texas was surrounded. 275 Texas soldiers were cut off in the forest. Germans surrounded them with a tight ring. Several breakthrough attempts failed. Time passed. The position of the surrounded became critical. They were running out of ammunition, medicine, food. The 442nd Regiment was ordered to rescue them. Commanders understood this was a suicide mission. The path to the surrounded troops went through fortified German positions in dense forest on a steep slope. Casualties would be enormous. But orders are orders. On the morning of October 26th, the offensive began. Soldiers went into attack under murderous fire. German machine guns were positioned in several tiers. Mortars covered the slopes with explosions. Snipers selected targets. Trees exploded from direct shell hits. The earth erupted in fountains. People fell by the dozens. Medics pulled out the wounded under fire, themselves becoming targets. Officers went ahead, encouraging soldiers. Many died in the first hours. Privates took command. When they too were killed, the next in line took over. The first day brought no breakthrough. At night, in the rain, soldiers dug in at captured positions. They slept in shifts in cold, wet foxholes. In the morning, they started again. Day after day, the same story. Advance, casualties, minimal progress. Companies melted away. Of 180 men, 50 remained, then 30. On the fourth day, it seemed strength was exhausted, but they continued. Go for broke meant not giving up, even when it seemed impossible to continue. They went forward, over the bodies of comrades, through pain and exhaustion, through fear and despair. On October 30th, advance units broke through to the surrounded troops. Contact was established. The Texans were saved. Of 275, 211 remained. But the price was horrifying. The 442nd Regiment lost more than 800 killed, wounded, and missing. Some companies lost more than 70% of personnel. The rescued Texans were stunned. They learned they had been saved by Japanese Americans whose families were in concentration camps. One Texas sergeant said, "These guys gave more than we could ever repay." A bond formed between veterans of both units that lasted decades. After the Vosges, the regiment was pulled back for rest. Losses were so severe that the unit needed complete reorganization. Replacements came straight from the camps. Young men who a month ago were behind barbed wire now had to take the places of fallen veterans. The winter of 1944 to 1945 was relatively quiet. The front stabilized. Soldiers healed physical and psychological wounds. Many wrote letters home, trying not to upset families with stories of real war horrors. They wrote about French towns, about the gratitude of locals, about the weather. And in the camps, families read these letters and prayed. They didn't know the whole truth, didn't know how their sons crawled through mud under machine gun fire, how they looked death in the eyes, how they held dying comrades in their arms. Soldiers spared them, but carried this burden inside themselves. In the spring of 1945, the regiment returned to Italy. The Germans held the Gothic Line, the last serious defensive position. Concrete fortifications, minefields, wire obstacles stretched across the mountains. Over years of war, the Germans had turned this place into an almost impregnable fortress. On April 5th, the final offensive began. The 442nd Regiment was ordered to capture key heights. The ascent was steep, almost vertical in some places. Soldiers scrambled up rocks, dragging weapons and equipment. Germans from above poured fire on them. The battle for each summit was desperate. German defenders knew there was nowhere to retreat. They fought fiercely, defending every meter. But the Japanese Americans were even more determined. They stormed bunkers, threw grenades at them, went into hand-to-hand combat. Hour by hour, meter by meter, they advanced upward. By evening, several key heights were taken. The Gothic Line was broken. This was the end of German defense in Italy. Their resistance began to collapse. The 442nd Regiment pursued the retreating enemy, liberating cities one after another. On April 22nd, they entered Alessandria. The city celebrated liberation. Soldiers marched through streets strewn with flowers. Girls kissed them. Old men cried with joy. For the soldiers, this was a sweet moment of triumph. They fought for others' freedom while their own families were not free. On May 2nd, German forces in Italy capitulated. The war for the 442nd Regiment was over. 20 months of continuous combat, from Rome to the Alps, thousands of kilometers across European fields, and thousands of their comrades lay in these fields. The statistics were horrifying. 9,486 casualties with an original strength of about 4,500, a casualty rate of 214%. This meant the average soldier was wounded more than twice. Some returned to duty 4 or 5 times after wounds. The awards were unprecedented. 18,114 individual decorations, 1 Medal of Honor, 52 Distinguished Service Crosses, 560 Silver Stars, over 4,000 Bronze Stars, 22 Legion of Merit Awards, 15 Soldiers' Medals, over 9,000 Purple Hearts for wounds, 7 Presidential Unit citations. More than any other unit of its size in the U.S. Army received during the war. The French and Italian governments awarded the regiment their highest honors. The 442nd became the most decorated unit of its size in American military history. But behind each award was a story of pain, a story of a young man who sacrificed himself, a family that lost a son, a mother who received a death notification at a concentration camp. These awards were written in blood on European fields. In July 1946, the regiment returned home. They were greeted as heroes, at least officially. They marched through Washington before tens of thousands of spectators. President Truman met them on the White House lawn. He said, "You fought not only the enemy, but you fought prejudice, and you won." The president's words were true, but incomplete. Yes, they fought prejudice, but did they win? Reality was more complex. Beyond official ceremonies, discrimination hadn't gone anywhere. Veterans were refused service in bars, denied employment, not sold homes in certain neighborhoods. A soldier in uniform with combat decorations could be turned away from a barber shop. He could be refused service in a restaurant. He could be insulted on the street. Medals and scars didn't protect against racism. The America they fought for still wasn't ready to accept them as equals. Many veterans didn't talk about the war. The Japanese-American cultural tradition of gaman, endurance and dignity in hardship, helped them remain silent. They locked memories deep inside, didn't talk about battles, didn't share pain, just silently lived on. They used veterans' benefits to get education, became doctors, lawyers, teachers, engineers, started families, raised children, worked twice as hard to prove their worth. And slowly, very slowly, Japanese Americans began to take their place in society. But the trauma of internment and war remained. Many suffered from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, nightmares, angry outbursts, depression. But in those days, people didn't talk about it. Men were supposed to be strong. They suffered in silence. Only in the 1980s did the country begin to acknowledge the injustice of internment. The Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians conducted an investigation and hearings. Veterans and internment survivors could finally tell their stories publicly. Years of silence broke into a flood of testimony. The Commission concluded that internment was not driven by military necessity. It was the result of racial prejudice, war hysteria, and failure of political leadership. No Japanese American was charged with espionage or sabotage during the war. Not one case. All accusations and suspicions were false. In 1988, Congress passed the Civil Liberties Act. President Reagan signed the law that officially apologized on behalf of the U.S. government. Each surviving internee was paid compensation of $20,000. Money couldn't return lost years, destroyed lives, deceased loved ones. But the acknowledgement meant a great deal. By that time, many veterans of the 442nd Regiment had already died. But those who lived finally heard what they had waited decades to hear: official recognition of injustice, an apology from the country they defended, confirmation that they were right and the system was wrong. In 2021, soldiers of Japanese American ancestry received the Medal of Honor, most from the 442nd Regiment. Their exploits, which had previously been recognized with lesser awards, finally received proper recognition. President Clinton presented the medals at the White House. Many were awarded posthumously. Their families accepted the awards with tears in their eyes. Among those honored was Senator Daniel Inouye, who lost his arm in combat in Italy. He served in the U.S. Senate for more than 50 years, becoming one of the country's most influential politicians. His life was an example of how far Japanese Americans could go despite all obstacles. The story of the 442nd Regiment became a symbol that patriotism doesn't depend on race, that loyalty is measured by actions, not ancestry, that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can triumph over injustice. Their motto, "Go for broke," took on meaning beyond the battlefield. It became a call for the entire Japanese American community to overcome barriers of discrimination, to break through prejudice, not to give up in the face of injustice. And they broke through. Today, memorials to soldiers of the 442nd Regiment stand in various cities: in Los Angeles, in San Francisco, in Washington. Museums preserve their stories. School children study their exploits. But the most important legacy is the changes their sacrifice brought to society. Their story asks us questions. How could it happen that a democratic country imprisoned its citizens in concentration camps based on race? How could it be that these same citizens then had to prove their loyalty with blood? These questions are uncomfortable, but they are necessary. The internment of Japanese Americans was one of the darkest episodes in American history. But the story of the 442nd Regiment shows the best in human nature: the ability to forgive, the ability to believe, the ability to sacrifice oneself for ideals, even when those ideals are betrayed. The camps are now museums. Manzanar is preserved as a National Historic Site. Visitors walk through grounds where barracks once stood. Read names on the memorial. Look at the mountains that surround this place. Try to imagine what it was like. And in Europe, white crosses mark soldiers' graves. At military cemeteries in France and Italy, they lie among thousands of other Americans who gave their lives for freedom. Their sacrifice was the same, but their path was unique. A path from concentration camp through battlefield to posthumous recognition.